Hello, everyone. This is early on in the course, and so I really want to talk about some of the early themes that we need to wrestle specifically with regard to in dealing with Christianity and ethics. It's a kind of an interesting thing to bring together because you can take a class on ethics, which is a subset of philosophy, and just discuss what it is that what are the frameworks by which people operate in operate ethically, how they function in society, the practicalities and the influences that they have for how they behave and how they see those relationships happening with others. But then we're also discussing what has been, in this class specifically, we want to discuss what have been some of the Christian theological and historical voices that have sought to contribute to that. And not just contribute to the issue of ethics, but make the case that Christianity as a religion, not just religion, but as a philosophy, as a way of looking at the world, as a worldview, actually produces a set of ethical principles that on their own construct the world, construct behaviors, construct the lens through which we see every ethical and moral dilemma. I was reviewing the other day a couple books in defense of the faith, Cornelius Van Til, and his an analysis of his thinking. Van Til's a little dense in terms of how deeply he gets into philosophy, and so there are a lot of publications that have sought to analyze his thinking, and actually subsequent to Van Til putting out his views on Christianity and ethics. There have been many authors that have sought to explain that, to expound on it. And Rushdoony wrote the book, By What Standard? And what's fascinating about that is that it's constantly asking the question, and later on Doug Wilson will do something similar in a video of yours, constantly asking the question of if one has looks at the world and they assume ethically that you have a grid, a set of, not just a set of rules, but a web of defining axioms that tell you do this because it's right, don't do this because it's wrong. These things are self-productive, these things are self-destructive. If you have that grid, which it claims that a philosophy such as Christianity would do, that's fine. But if you want to have an alternative one, well, then the case needs to be made for the merits of that alternative. And following the 19th century philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw a philosophical progression in the West whereby men would eventually abandon those old ancient webs that grids that they see the world through. The dilemma came up is if you abandon those, what will you have in its place? If you get rid of the old guards, if you get rid of the old lens through which you view everything, the manner in which someone determines right and wrong, ethical, unethical, productive or destructive, if those things are no longer there, what will you replace it with? And Friedrich Nietzsche's prediction was that people would replace it with either nihilism, and that is nothing is of any meaning because you just do what you want. I mean, ultimately, one of the issues that and this is discussed in a different course, but one of the issues of the Scopes monkey trial of the early 20th century was that many were concerned that evolution would have a logical progression of basically dispensing with moral frameworks, because if you think about it, evolution is simply a series of differential survivorships where it has no morality to it. It simply is what has emerged over time in terms of what species and what adaptations within species have been able to adapt to environments and therefore procreate and make certain variations within those species dominant based upon the changing conditions of the time. But there's no morality associated with evolution. There's no, there just is. There's no ought. What is versus what ought to be. There's none of that. It's simply the raw happenings of a nature in constant motion. And early figures within the American scheme in the American spotlight, or who, especially around the early part of the 20th century, were very concerned that the modernism of that had gone through it had seen itself modernism that had seen itself play out in European academies, which finds itself here to the U.S., and then the chief of that would be evolution, that actually would wind up being detrimental to people's ethical assumptions, ethical framework, because you can't glean morality from that sense of just the sheer blind raw nature of life and death and adaptation. And so they were concerned that that eventually men would abandon the ethical frameworks of Christianity. And that's why they fought against evolution as it related to how that conflict arose between evolution and, say, narratives related to the Bible. And in my class on Bible and Modern Science, we deal with that more. But in that sense, they were concerned about where evolution would take us, not because they were. It wasn't necessarily a concern that we'll lose our narrative, our myth about how the earth was created in 6 days. What they're concerned about is if evolution really has its way, we'll have an entirely different effect over here, and that is, what will we do with people who don't have, if you can't tell people anymore that God made everything, then how can you tell them that God actually is watching what you do and has an opinion about how you operate, how you behave, how society comes together? Where will morality go? You won't have any ethical, moral standard by which to tell someone this is self-destructive, that's self-productive, this is right, that's wrong. What will you do? And you won't have any standard left that you can convey to people. And that was part of Nietzsche's reflection, that prediction that if you do away with the old ancient guards, and this was in the idea of the death of God, where the idea of man eventually progresses to the point where God is dead, because humanity will progress to the point it just doesn't need him anymore. But that was actually a lamenting on his part, because when you don't need that anymore, what will you replace it with? Well, it typically gets replaced with either nihilism or totalitarianism, and some would say that some of the horrible atrocities that happened in the 20th century related to Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia, or Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, all these things are actually fulfilled Nietzsche's predictions. But the concern is valid, though. If you get rid of one thing, what do you replace it with? If you get rid of the old guards, what will happen in its place? Something of a power vacuum occurs within the human condition. If you say that those old messages by which people were controlled, I say controlled in air quotes, but those messages by which people were controlled, if you get rid of those, what will take place? What will happen in its place? There's an interesting, the Christian theologians have approached this from the perspective, and philosophers will disagree, but the Christian theologians and philosophers have approached this from the basic idea of humanity has a need for such grids, has a need for such the ethical, moral web through which it views the world. There's a verse in the Bible. It's Proverbs 29:18. Anyway, I believe it's in Proverbs, where the verse goes like this. It says, "Where there is no vision, people perish." And that oftentimes has been quoted in business seminars when some CEO has some sort of religious background and tries to claim that he needs to cast a vision, has a vision for his company to show where it needs to go. That verse has nothing to do with having vision for the future. What it means is, where Christian theologians look at this, and it says, the verse actually in Hebrew means where there is no vision, meaning prophetic vision, meaning vision in those days, prophetic vision would be revelation from God. God speaking, or it's within an ancient Israelite, religious framework of where there was no vision, meaning the prophets would have a vision and tell you what God wants. And so therefore, when none of that is happening, when God's not telling you what to do, the people perish, meaning the actual Hebrew phrase is they cast off restraint. So taken together, the Hebrew translation from Proverbs, from this verse in Proverbs, is where there is no prophetic vision or God talking to people, they cast off restraint and self-destruct. Well, that's the point of Christian theologians as they address this idea of ethics, of the standards by which people decide right or wrong, ethical, unethical, and what are the appropriate ways in which people interact with the world around them. In regard to they use this from studying sacred literature of the Bible, which I've even said in a message. You don't have to have a copy of the Bible for this course, but there are so many different free versions of it online that it behooves you to take a look and find the different versions online that you can. There are many ones, but you want to be able to look at the passages where the authors that you reference here in your readings, from Wolgamon, from Ramsey, from Budichevsky, you want to be able to look those up and kind of see where those come from. But the idea is that theologians in the past and even in the present day, approach this sacred literature. They glean these ideas from the Bible, from sacred literature, and they extrapolate out that there's a standard by which people are given their framework, their moral jumping off point, their moral compass with which to conduct themselves in a world, and without it, people cast off restraint and perish. That's the perspective of these theologians and those Christian thinkers. And what Rushdoony, Cornelius Van Til and Rushdoony bring up is that that's the Christian perspective. But they would ask someone who doesn't come from that perspective, okay, if you don't want to come from a Christian perspective, fine, but everybody has a standard. So you're going to need to explain to me yours. If you say, well, I don't want a religious standard imposed upon me for how I conduct myself in the world, either from an ethical standpoint, from a moral standpoint, and we'll talk a little bit about how morals and ethics overlap. They're not simultaneous, but they do overlap some. We'll talk about that in the future. But if you're going to talk about how one conducts themselves in the world ethically, morally, and you don't want a standard that has as its roots and has as its development religious thought over several millennia. If you don't want that, fine, but you're going to need to argue for the standard you adopt then, and so that when you come up to a situation and you have to think about what should I do, where should I go, or or you have an opinion about how others are, and you're thinking about what should be done in this instance, what should be done in this case. The question then arises, by what standard do you say that? And that's Rushdoony's point of view, and as he analyzes Cornelius Van Til. And that is, by what standard do you have an opinion? Do you opine as to whether something is profitable, unprofitable? If something is ethical, unethical, moral, immoral? So, for example, if we say, the low-hanging fruit is always Nazi Germany. I'm astounded by how many people actually sometimes even aren't even sure the Holocaust happened. I don't understand that at all. But there's so much documentation and so much history for us with regard to Nazi Germany that's always low-hanging fruit. We can use them as an example. And the reason why it's good to use them as an example is because of all the different ways in which we look at Nazi Germany and we learn from that experience that we're really not that different from them. We're capable of the same things. And so it's actually a good window into humanity and where a society can go and what people are capable of without some sort of exterior restraints. That's a very good example of casting off restraint. And Christian theologians really, in many cases, had a big collective "see, I told you so" when Nazi Germany came to power and everything that had happened there. But if you don't have a framework that you want to use you don't want one that has as its roots or has as its history religious thought contributing to it, or even has as its origins stemming out of religious thought in some way, that's fine. But if you're going to look at Nazi Germany and pass judgment on them, then the question comes up, by what standard do you judge them? By what standard do you consider that to have been evil? In some cases many cases acting unethically, and not just ethics according to, not just in ethics in terms of internally, but internationally, breaking of treaties and so forth. So by what standard do you pass judgment upon them? Certainly the dictates of evolution simply are that it occurred, therefore it was going to. So science about that is rather neutral. And this is what early theologians were concerned about. So the question that comes up is, and Van Til, Rushdoony, others would say, if you don't want to pass judgment upon things like that from a moral framework that has as its roots a lot of Judeo-Christian assumptions to them, by what standard do you judge it, or consider a thing to have been evil? Do you think that there's evil in the world? Do you think there's a concept? And do you think there is such a thing as evil? Or is everybody just misunderstood? Or is everything relegated into mental health categories? So by what standard would something be declared good or evil? And again, to be redundant, by what standard do we declare a thing to be good or bad at all? These are some of the questions that theologians have sought to answer. And in your reading, when you get further deep into that, you're going to have to wrestle with these questions too. All right?